Hi and welcome back to the Girl Gone London channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylin. I'm a dual UK and American citizen, and today we're doing an emergency video addressing US and UK tea culture because, you guys, there is a controversy brewing. Honestly, I just crack myself up. Okay, anyways. If you're behind on the drama, there have been some serious developments in UK and US relations in the past 24 hours. The short version is, Professor Michelle Francl, an American chemist, has written a book all about tea called Steeped: The Chemistry of Tea. And in the book, she apparently asserts that adding salt to your tea actually makes it taste better, as the salt apparently blocks the receptor, which makes tea taste bitter. Now, in doing research for this video, I wanted to make sure I said Professor Francl's name right, so I ended up on a site of YouTube I had never been before, which was basically chemistry professors giving lectures on fascinating things like the intersection of science and religion. But the point is, I have done my research and I can attest that she is a well-qualified, well-researched human, clearly highly intelligent. She knows what she's talking about, except she's also accidentally started an international incident, which is also fantastic PR for her book, so I'm honestly in awe of Michelle. But you know, this has sent UK social media into an uproar because adding salt to your tea in the UK is just so not how it's done. And there's nothing British people love more than tea and trying to make the perfect cup of it. So some words have been exchanged. Now, the US Embassy, before this turns into like a reverse Boston Tea Party, has issued a statement that ensures their British counterparts understand that they do not, in any uncertain terms, condone putting salt in your tea. But of course, they've been in the UK long enough to develop a sense of humor, so their statement finishes with an assertion that Americans will continue to make their tea the proper way, by microwaving it. Then, the Cabinet Office responded and was like, thank you for your support, but we do not stand by making tea in anything other than a kettle. Thank you very much. Good day to you. And now the internet is sort of freaking out. So I thought to myself, Kaylin, this is your moment. This is what you have been preparing for ever since you decided to turn your channel into a deep dive of UK versus US differences so we can all understand each other a little bit better. That being said, I think it's time to address tea on both sides of the pond, and if the comment section goes down in absolute flames, so be it. Okay, so difference number one, the amount of tea consumption. It is no secret that Brits love tea. This is not a stereotype. This is an actual fact. And to prove it, let's look at a table of tea consumption per country. It turns out the UK ranks third in the world, and if we keep searching to try and find the US, Americans are in 35th place when it comes to tea consumption, clearly a long ways behind. I mean, you cannot compete with the UK when it comes to tea. It's estimated that they drink 100 million cups every single day. Every day. And I literally came across a Reddit thread the other day where an employer was like, hey guys, one of my employees drinks a ridiculous amount of tea and I feel like it's actually too much and I don't know how to bring it up for them, for their own health, and also the shared office resources. Now, do Americans drink tea? Yes, they do. Many will have tea bags in their pantries, called a cupboard in the UK, so it's not like Americans don't drink tea. We just don't drink it as much, and when it comes to hot tea or hot drinks, American culture tends to prefer coffee. There are actual historic reasons, by the way, why Americans don't drink tea as much as the Brits, but before we dig into that, let's go over difference number two, the types of tea that we drink. So in the UK, if someone offers you tea, it's going to be hot, and it's likely going to be something like an Earl Grey, an English breakfast tea, an everyday tea, essentially a black tea blend. Of course, the tea aisle in the UK supermarket is incredibly bulked out with all kinds of different teas. I'm just saying this is the default that we're working with. In the US, it's said that 85% of tea consumption is actually cold tea or iced tea. Iced tea is an extremely popular drink in the American South and in many places across America. This is a black tea that you brew hot, sweeten with sugar, and then refrigerate until it's ice cold. You can also get unsweetened iced tea or half sweet, half unsweet. In much of the US, if you are looking for a hot tea, you would need to specify this to your waiter or waitress because they're almost automatically going to assume in many places, especially at a restaurant, that you are going to want an iced tea if you ask for a tea. Whereas if you order tea in the UK, it is definitely coming to you hot. Our third difference has to do with the strength of the tea. British teas of all types are typically stronger than most American varieties and will likely be more bitter and include more caffeine. Brands like Yorkshire Tea and Tetley's have a different quality of tea than popular American tea brands like Lipton, and again, this is down to the preferences of the consumers and the markets. I can say, as someone raised in the US on sweet tea, I don't particularly like tea in general. I know, someone take away my UK passport. But I haven't gotten used to the taste of a cup of tea in England yet, and I've been here 10 years. Even with the same brand, for instance, Twinings, this internet poster thought they were losing their mind in 2006 when they taste tested Twinings bought in the UK and US. And they found that even though the US Twinings said that it was blended in London and it seemed like an import, the package of Twinings straight from the UK was much richer and, in their opinion, better than the US counterpart. So maybe it's not just that Americans don't like tea as much as the British, it's because the tea in the US just isn't as good. In a minute, we'll move on to some other interesting differences like tea in the workplace and what we might add to our teas, but I do want to address the next difference, the history of tea in each country, because Americans aren't entirely to blame for not being experts on all things tea. Let's start with tea history in the UK because it's much longer and much less fraught with people throwing things into the harbour. Tea has been well loved in the UK since the 18th century, and while it started as an upper class drink, eventually it filtered down, guys. Tea started to be sold in England, first and foremost in the 1650s, and it first started to gain traction as a medicinal drink. So a fun fact is that increasing tea consumption in the 18th century in England meant that mortality rates went down. Why? Not just because they were drinking tea, but because it meant that people started to boil their water, which decreased the amount of waterborne diseases. Amazing. Thank you, tea. So as I mentioned, at first, tea was much more expensive than coffee in the UK, so it was popular among the upper class of English society, particularly with women who would drink it during social occasions. But in the 1700s, an increase in supply meant that tea was becoming increasingly popular with more people and with more classes because the increasing amount of tea dropped the prices, meaning that the middle class in England now had access to it. As Wikipedia put it, tea drinking was almost considered patriotic by this point, and by the 19th century, the working class had also caught on. This was more connected with enjoying a hot cup of tea during the workday than at home, and also because tea can be diluted a little easier than coffee and still tastes good, which saves money. So again, everyone had found something to love over the years about drinking tea. And the trade of tea itself played a huge role in supporting the rise of the British Empire and had other social and political implications connected to it. It's not just tea in the UK, it's so much more. It's patriotism, it's respectability, it's comfort, it's an all in this together type of drink. It's able to be both high class at a fancy afternoon tea and lower class in a cheap mug that keeps your hands warm while working in the cold and wet all day long. Now in the US, moving across the pond, tea is just tea. And the reason we don't drink it as much as the British has a lot to do with what happened during the colonial days. So, when the British first colonized much of America, tea was an incredibly popular drink among all classes. The new Americans were on board. They were like, yes, we love tea because we're basically British people just living in another country and calling ourselves American. But around the time of the American Revolution, things started to change. There was something first called the Townshend Acts in 1767 that essentially taxed tea for the American colonists. Now, suddenly, tea was much more expensive. But it didn't immediately all kick off because you could still smuggle cheaper tea into America. But then the British caught on to that. So the Tea Act of 1773 comes along and changes everything. This act essentially allowed the East India Company to undercut cheaper tea sales in America from the colonial tea importers. The British did this to continue to be able to collect taxes on tea from the American colonies, but the Americans at this point were not having it. They were well aware of the motives of this act, and they were at the point where there was no amount of talking it out that could be done with the British Parliament. They lost their collective minds over tea, which honestly, such a reminder that these people were still British at heart, and threw a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party to protect this act. And if you're like, Americans, just pay your taxes, why are you so upset? The problem in the colonies at the time was that Americans felt they were being taxed unfairly. They were being taxed without representation in the parliament that was making these choices. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry in the colonies, and suddenly drinking tea becomes unpatriotic as well as expensive. Americans turned to other drinks like coffee, and the days of Americans drinking tea with the same frequency as the Brits were over. Now, moving on to our fifth difference, what do we put in a cup of black tea? As has been evidenced by the absolute outpouring of shock across the internet when Professor Francel suggested adding salt to your tea, the Brits have a very perfected and standard way of making a cup of tea, and for many people, it includes milk and sugar. Not everyone has both, some just have one, but at least adding milk to a cup of tea is seen as very, very common. People often categorize their tea by the color and how pale it is, as the more milk that you add, the more pale the tea becomes. So you kind of have like a tea color wheel that you can use to express to somebody else how to make your perfect cup of tea. In the US, many people will drink hot tea with lemon or honey, but not milk as standard. Most people will just have it plain with nothing added. Again, I'm not saying that no American ever has milk with their tea, because I know you'll chime in the comments and say that you enjoy milk with your tea. I'm just saying, as a vast generalization, Americans won't add milk to their cup of hot tea like a British person would. And despite Professor Francel's recommendations, which, I don't know, give it a try, I don't know. But Americans don't actually typically add salt to their tea as standard, so let that reassure you, my British friends, that your original colonies haven't completely lost their minds, despite some modern-day tea revolutionary suggestions. Okay, our next difference has to do with how we heat up the water for tea. Yes, the US Embassy was correct in their joke, but they also weren't joking, because Americans typically tend to favor the microwave when heating up tea, even though this might start another UK versus US tea war. Here's the deal, you guys. In the UK, it is unheard of to not boil the water for your tea with an electric kettle. I could do an entire video about kettles in the UK, and in fact, I think I'm going to. But this is just what you do. It is unfathomable to somebody here that you would do anything else to heat up your water for tea. But in the US, many people don't have electric kettles. So if you're making tea at home, what are you gonna do? You could boil water on the stove in a pot or pan, but that seems like a chore. Or you could stick it in the microwave to heat it up that way, and that's just what many of us do. It's fast, it's set it and forget it, similar to a kettle, it gets the job done, so there you go. I am just the messenger. Please do not come for me. I'm just explaining the differences. And our last difference has to do with the workplace, because there is a unique British cultural element that has to do with tea on the job. And that is that A, tea is so commonly enjoyed that many people are enjoying multiple cups a day, including at work. And B, people often make tea in rounds, particularly in a workplace, meaning that someone will stand up and say that they're about to go make themselves a cup of tea, and they'll ask, does anyone else want a cup? So they could easily be making 3, 4, 5 teas at one time. Doesn't matter if you're the boss or the intern or anywhere in between, this goes for everybody. Later on in the day, somebody else who had tea made for them earlier will then offer to go and make the tea and ask who wants one. In many offices, if you just get up and go make your own tea without asking if anyone else wants one, that would be seen as rude or a little bit standoffish. This is because it's not just tea in the UK, as we found out. It's so much more. It's a way to relate. It's a group thing. It's a social norm. It's a way to show people that you care about them because you remember how they like their tea. It's for good times. It's for bad times. It's for sitting down with while watching TV. It's for warming up with on a cold winter day or having just because you can on a hot summer's day. It's for pairing with a slice of cake in the afternoon. It's something to get you going in the morning. It goes without being said that America does not have this tea culture in the workplace or otherwise, and while we do have many other cultures surrounding shared food and drinks in the US, tea is not one of them. This brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this chat all about UK versus US tea. Let me know in the comments which country you're from and how you like your tea, or if you even drink it. Now, try and stay civil, everyone, because this is probably the most hot button issue I've covered in a video yet. Be kind to your fellow citizen of the planet, even if they like their tea in a weird way. Let's all get along. Comment below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.